Right, we have to start. The post-war period. God, this is loud. You've heard quite a bit about it already in Showman's lecture with regards to India, and in Neil Jackson's lecture concerning the United States. And we will return to the topic again next week when Ewan Harrison will talk about post-war period in Britain. Today we will be covering Europe and to a lesser extent Japan, and there will be an awful lot to say about it. So let's start with this. Today's lecture will be divided into two parts. The first part will cover the immediate post-war period, so the late 1940s and early 1950s. We will start with briefly outlining the planning context, which is essentially the functionalist doctrine put forward by the International Congresses of Modern Architecture, which I mentioned in an earlier lecture. So they regathered after the war and really advanced their agenda, or at least they tried. We will then talk about the two main architectural trends, or fashion, well, let's not call them fashions, trends, currents, which emerged in the late 1940s. One was this Misesian tradition, which Professor Jackson talked about. So Mises' post-war work was incredibly influential and spread globally, and not least in Europe. And the second tendency was the Corbusier's tradition, which went back to Corbusier's post-war work, notably 4 buildings he built in the early 1950s in France. And this is today, or the tradition which he founded through these buildings is today better known as brutalism. In the second part, we will talk about the events from the 1960s onward through the 1970s and into the early 1980s. We will again start with the changed planning context, notably the work of a young group of, or a group of young architects within SIAM, a sort of breakaway group called Team 10, who were incredibly influential on architectural developments in post-war Europe. And we will look at not just their thinking, but also some examples of their work. From the mid-1960s onward, there was a sort of reaction to modern architecture. For the first 2 decades after the war, it really dominated. Especially this Misesian and Corbusian tradition really dominated the architectural scene in Europe. And then from the mid-1960s onward, we see challenges to this, a sort of pluralism consisting of a variety of approaches which opposed this modernist doctrine, and these are generally referred to under the umbrella term postmodernism. Now, these two images I've shown you before in a different context. On the right-hand side is Dresden in 1945. Dresden was one of the most heavily bombed cities in Europe. It sort of shows the scale of devastation in Western Europe, and particularly in the defeated nations, notably Germany. And on the left-hand side, you see the cover of the Athens Charter, written by Le Corbusier, based on the SIAM conference in 1933, which sort of put forward a view of cities as divided into 4 basic functions. So this is the functionalist city. Dwelling, work, recreation, and transport. That's what a city consists of. So here we have a problem, and here we have a ready-made solution, or at least this is what the modernist pioneers within SIAM hoped would happen. And it didn't quite turn out that way, but we'll come to that later. Now, as I mentioned, the Athens Charter divided cities into 4 functions: dwelling, work, recreation, and transport. The more alert architects within SIAM soon realized that this really painted a rather incomplete picture of cities. In particularly, it made no provision for the sort of social activities, cultural activities, political activities, which city dwellers may wish to pursue. So they started working on an extension of these 4 functions in the form of another function, which sort of created a sense of communities or civic monumentality. So they thought, in addition to the 4 functions, that there needed to be something for people to gather, for people to engage in cultural activities, and they developed this civic core. This project here by Sert and Wiener for a motor city in Brazil is pretty much the first modernist scheme that we know that tried to integrate this city core. So what you have here is a number of parallel housing slabs. And then along this main avenue, you have a sort of civic core developing towards this square here. Here you would have shops, restaurants and stuff like that. Here was a technical school. This was a new town for industrial workers who were employed in a nearby tractor and airplane factory. So there was a technical school, there was a hotel, there were loads of like gathering spaces, and it being Brazil, culminated in this new football stadium. You can see it here in a little bit more detail. So this was an extension of the 4 functions in the form of a civic core. The same idea is also noticeable in this plan by Le Corbusier for Saint-Dié in France. Now, the motor city was a new town, or would have been a new town, it wasn't built. And Saint-Dié, on the other hand, was planned for reconstruction of a heavily devastated French city in northern France. You can see some of the ruins over here, and here the sort of slightly destroyed church integrated in this new plan. Now, we can see very clearly the functional division which drove Siam thinking. So you have 8 massive parallel housing slabs, so-called unités d'habitation. We'll come back to that in a moment. And clearly separated from this dwelling units through the river. On the other side of the river, we have the industrial plants. And then in between the buildings, you have these generous green spaces, which are for recreation. And it's all divided or tied together, rather divided, by these major roads here. So transport. So these are the 4 functions. But obviously, we have something else here as well. You can see it here in a bit more detail. Again, this idea of a civic core, which really was something, a real novelty in functionalist planning, pointing back towards more traditional ideas of urbanism. So axial planning, centrality, civic monumentality. In the motor city, which we saw just a few moments ago, it was a sort of rather enclosed space. Here, on the other hand, we have an open platform with a number of sort of randomly arranged public buildings, a hotel, a civic auditorium, which you can see here, and this square spire would have been a museum. Now, neither of these projects was realized. In the sort of immediate post-war period, people were rather keen on repairing and reconstructing what had already been there, rather than sort of embarking on these new ventures. That was one reason. The more important reason was there were very serious material and labor shortages, and there simply weren't the means to build anything like this. What was built looked more or less like this. This is called New Empiricism, which sort of swapped over from Scandinavia and to a lesser degree from Switzerland. It's a sort of attempt to marry modern architecture to more traditional building forms, to make them, to give modernism a sort of friendlier face and make it more appealing to popular taste. They're not bad buildings. They're actually quite nice. They are also, especially in Switzerland, exceptionally well planned and landscaped. You can see here a primary school in Zurich, still in use today. The idea behind planning such as these was to create so-called neighborhood units, which would comprise all the vital functions of a neighborhood, housing, shops, and the primary school. And the general sort of guiding principles of schools such as this one here was for school children to be able to walk to their primary school without ever crossing a major road. And this is exactly what they did. And it pretty much still works like this today. So, you know, rather pleasant sort of buildings. However, architecturally, they don't really do much for me. And because this is my lecture, we will swiftly move on to more exciting stuff. This is the first of these two major traditions which started to dominate architecture globally and especially in Europe. You've seen all these buildings before, I think. Obviously, Professor Jackson spoke about Mies van der Rohe's architecture, which became very popular, especially for corporate architecture. And there were essentially two prototypes, both going back to Mies van der Rohe. One is this sort of sprawling suburban campus, which goes back to Mies van der Rohe's master plan and buildings for the IIT campus, the Illinois Institute of Technology. And the best building on that campus is Crown Hall here, which Professor Jackson discussed in some detail. The second prototype was the sort of inner city high-rise, curtain-walled inner city high-rise, which also goes back to Mies van der Rohe and specifically to his competition entry for Friedrichstraße in Berlin, which I showed you in my modernism lecture. The first to actually realize such a building wasn't Mies van der Rohe himself, this is Mies van der Rohe, but some of his followers, Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. This is the Lever House. It really is one of those crucial buildings in architectural history. When Mies van der Rohe built it himself, it was sort of darker, more precise in a way, but it sort of lacked this complete openness which Skidmore, Owings and Merrill's had. So these are the two prototypes which started to influence architecture globally, particularly corporate architecture. This is a particularly good example from Europe, early example, sort of based on this campus type. This is a exhibition pavilion for the 1958 International Exhibition in Brussels by Egon Eiermann. Now, very clear concept. The entire complex consists of 8 pavilions, 3 different sizes, so 4 small ones, 3 middle ones, and 1 large one, arranged around a cluster of mature trees. So, you know, taking notice of the existing landscape, and all linked via these walkways, which strengthen the horizontal emphasis of the entire facility, but also help mediate between the different levels. As you can see, it's a rather slopey terrain. The pavilions themselves are all square, and they are all accessed asymmetrically, so off the central axis. So very clear concept-driven scheme. Architecturally, the most noticeable thing is this extreme horizontal emphasis which Eiermann tried to create and actually did create. So these black floor slabs supported by several details. Look, for instance, at these vertical supports, which are painted black, so you can see them very well when it's dark and the pavilions are lit. But most people would visit this exhibition during the day. And during the day, because they're black and because they're recessed, you can barely see them, which strengthens this extreme horizontal emphasis. What else is there to say about this? Notice these vertical sort of very slender steel tubes, which have no functional purpose. They're mere decoration, if you will, but they show the grid on which the entire facility is planned. If you paid attention in Professor Jackson's second lecture, it will remind you of the slender eye profiles which Mies van der Rohe attached to his Lakeshore Drive apartment. So this is where this idea comes from. Very refined, very elegant. The windows as well, as you can see, they are also recessed from the edge of the floor plates. This has several reasons. First of all, again, it strengthens the horizontal emphasis. Secondly, it shades the interior and reduces glare inside it. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, it creates this sort of continuous gallery which goes around the entire complex, which meant that you could walk around the entire thing without ever entering one of the pavilions, which is a rather lovely idea, works very well for exhibition buildings such as this one here, and was in fact copied several times in the following years. This one here is inspired by the second type, the sort of curtain wall high-rise type. Obviously this is not a high-rise, but you can clearly see the curtain wall, again, strongly inspired by, not so much by Mies's own buildings, but by the Lever House. The detailing, the elevation treatment, and also the green-tinted windows, which was sort of telltale of the Lever House. It's quite an interesting building, this one. So you go underneath the building and turn right, and this is the main entrance, which brings you into this vertical circulation core, which is this one here. And then you go into your actual office level, which is completely free of support, apart from these two pairs of concrete piers, which carry the entire building, and which has these, which support these cantilevering floor plates, which taper towards the edge, allowing Jacobsen, who was the architect, famous Danish architect, to attach this curtain wall to either side of the building. Now, the interesting thing about this building here is that it sort of fakes its machine aesthetic. So in the United States, this type of architecture was possible and was sort of supported by a totally advanced building industry, which prefabricated all these elements, which then only had to be assembled on site. Okay, so in the case of the Lever House, the building is a clear expression of the method by which it was built. Here, completely different. Building industry in Europe wasn't as advanced, not yet at the time, so they couldn't actually prefabricate all these things. And this facade, although it looks as though it was, the result of a very advanced building technology, is in fact handmade, all of it. All these profiles were handmade, so this is handicraft, not prefabrication or industrial building. In fact, the glass front itself is attached to the concrete slabs via a very clumsy timber substructure, so not steel or aluminium as you would expect and as would be the case in an American skyscraper. And you can see it. You can see it here. This sort of fringe here, Jacobsen had it painted dark green, so that from afar, if you look at it from afar, it looks as though these profiles cast a shade onto the light green tainted windows, but that's not the case. This is merely painted dark green, as you can see, because it goes all the way round. So he went to great lengths to sort of give the impression of this being a modern, American-type skyscraper, but it wasn't. But it was almost a sort of wake-up call or a pointer to the building industry to sort of get their act together. This is what the buildings we want to build are going to look like. So make the means available to us to actually build them. And they did. And only a few years later, this is another building, also by Arne Jacobsen. A couple of years later, only a couple of blocks up the road, this is completely prefabricated now. To explain the building itself, SAS building, Scandinavian Air Services, so National Air Carrier, it had to accommodate three different things: a hotel, a travel agency, and an airport terminal. Professor Jackson mentioned last week, I think it was, this sort of upper-class romanticism which came with air travel in the mid-1950s up to the early 1960s, before it became commercialized. So this upper-class vibe which it had. And this building sort of illustrates this a little bit. There was an airport terminal within the hotel, which I find rather amazing. I'd love to have that. A very tight inner-city block, as you can sort of make out here. So the hotel is in this tower, and the travel agency is here, and the airport terminal is here. So travel agency here, airport terminal here in this lower building, both illuminated via these generous skylights. The concept, again, is directly taken from the Lever House. This is called a tower and podium building, which is one of these post-war building types which were copied everywhere. Tower, podium, okay? So to sort of divide functions into a vertical feature and a horizontal feature taking up the entire plot. Jacobsen originally designed everything here, not just the building, but all the interiors, all the design features, down to the cutlery. But nowadays it's been taken over by the Radisson Group, and they obviously replaced all these lovely original 1950s design features with their own rather tedious corporate design. But outside it still looks like this. That was its original look. I must say I'm rather fond of it. Most people don't like it a lot, and the citizens of Copenhagen regularly voted the most horrible building they have. Why do they vote it like the most horrible building they have? Because it's being copied, or sort of similar buildings were built everywhere. And it's really difficult to sort of distinguish, or to pick the gems out of this swamp of anonymous office architecture. But this one is a good one. It's not quite as good as this one, though. This really is a superb building. Pirelli Tower in Milan by Gio Ponti and his engineer Pierluigi Nervi, who was one of the really brilliant structural engineers of the 20th century. You can see the sort of familiar Miesian features of, curtain wall consisting of metal panels and glazing and all that sort of thing. But you also see that this is not a mere copy. I mean, that's a really original take on this high-rise building type. It's extremely slim, and it's extremely high. In fact, it was the highest building in Italy up until the 1990s. Extremely slim, extremely high. You have a serious problem because of the wind loads that batter against the longer sides of the building. So you have to stabilize it. And what Pierluigi Nervi did was he had these 8 massive concrete piers, which you can see here, 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 and here. And they become thinner. They're really massive at the bottom, as you can see here. I mean, they're proper foundations. And they become thinner towards the top, in accordance with the diminishing structural loads. And that stiffens the building. There's an auditorium here as well. So these are all office floors. That's one of them. And this is an auditorium which is buried underground, which is about twice the size of this one here. And then over here, a car park as well. And then these massive foundations becoming thinner. And really cleverly, as you can see, the 2 middle ones go beyond the roof level, and they carry this flying canopy, which creates this really nice shaded line, the most elegant way of topping up a skyscraper that I can think of. It's really nice. And you've got a similar sort of vertical black line over here, in between here and in between here. So these are two massive wedges at either end of the building, which brace the building, and for which Joe Ponti, the architect, had a good functional reason as well. He argued because the central circulation core is here, foot traffic would diminish towards the edges. So the building doesn't need to be quite as wide over there, and this is what creates this sort of odd shape of the building. Lovely building, immediately copied worldwide. Amongst others, Walter Gropius, the Pan Am building, has exactly the same shape, and Seifert's Alpha Tower in Birmingham, about which we might hear more next week, is also clearly inspired by this. Brilliant building. On the whole, however, this sort of Miesian tradition soon became boring, copied, unimaginative, and there were only few architects in the immediate post-war period who really had the strength of their creative convictions and put forward a type of architecture which was really individualistic, idiosyncratic. And the best of them was Le Corbusier, whom we can see here, with a model of the Unité d'Habitation. If you remember, in the 1920s and 1930s, Le Corbusier produced a number of theoretical studies on which he based his buildings, so the Maison Domino, Maison Citroën. And these Unités d'Habitation is another of these theoretical prototypes which he created and then tried to sort of mass produce and adapt to different conditions. This one here was a solution for the housing crisis after the war. So a lot of people homeless, where to house them and how, and this was his idea. And this is what it looked like when he actually built it. He built about a handful of them, and this was the first one and the best one. This sits in Marseille, and the idea here was to basically, that was to be the first of many to follow, eventually housing all 50,000 homeless people in Marseille and possibly all 4 million homeless people in Paris. So he wasn't exactly modest in his ambitions. Now, the basic idea here is to create a complete community within the building. So this is not merely a housing block. This is supposed to be, almost a little city all in one block, including communal facilities such as nurseries, shops, laundries, and so on, and sit in wide parkland. So sort of concentrating all the functions in one high-density block and then giving the rest to nature. It's really important to understand the basic concept of this, because in later years, this building type was copied or adopted in inner-city context. So, high-density inner-city plots, and they built it there. That was never the idea of it. It really only works if there is this nature complementing the building itself. It also needs these communal facilities to work as a community, if you will. And these two were immediately dropped once local authorities started to build these buildings, not just here in Britain, but here in Britain as well, because obviously maintaining communal facilities costs money, and they were immediately cut when the requirement came up to save money, and that too makes them rather desolate places. This one worked well, and it's very popular still today. Basically, what else can we say? Well, these are all dwellings, I think 33 stories. There's a vertical circulation in there, and it links 3 public spaces, basically. One public space is the ground floor, which you can't see here very well, but we can see it in another picture later on. So the whole building stands on massive concrete stilts, and the idea was that the surrounding landscape sort of extends underneath the building. Then halfway up the building, you have this shopping street, which is where most of the communal facilities were located, and then it all leads up to this sculpturally articulated roof, which is a typical Corbusian feature, which we can see in a little bit more detail here. It will remind you of the Villa Savoye. It's the sort of thing he always did. Here, used for a number of public facilities. So the idea was sort of inspired by a ocean liner, and the main deck of an ocean liner. So there were children's playgrounds on here, which you can't see, but there was a nursery here, and a small theater here, accessed via this ramp, and then along the edge of the building was a running track. So it had all these additional facilities. The best thing about it, though, and the reason why it became such a often copied prototype, was the arrangement of the dwellings themselves. And there were, I think, 23 different apartment types, housing anything from a single person to a family of 6. But the main type was this one here. And it's really clever. So to explain, you have this central corridor, which is really generous in its dimensions. So it's not just a narrow corridor. Le Corbusier called it an interior street. That's, a little bit exaggerated, but it's quite generous. And you have these 2 apartments, which are sort of duplex semi-maisonettes, which are interlocked. So one leads on top of the corridor, and the other one underneath it. So if you want to go there, here's your entrance. You go past the kitchen into the main double-story living room, and then upstairs into the private quarters. This type A works a little bit better than the type B, which is a bit awkward because you come in on the upper story where there's only a kitchen, and then the kitchen's not linked to the living room, so you have to go downstairs and sort of turn around slightly awkwardly. Still good, but not as good as this one here. So the good thing about it is, A, it gives dual aspect to all dwellings, and because the corridor is on a strict north-south axis, it means you get morning sun and evening sun in the same apartment. And it also saves circulation space, because you only need the corridor on every 3rd level. Okay? So it's really clever. Again, this one here are these massive stilts which sort of open. It's a bit shady, but still it opens the ground floor, and children can play there, and etc. And then you got this shopping street halfway up the building, and there are sort of humanizing features in here. So these colored partition walls between the balconies, and the entire elevation is based on a proportional system which Le Corbusier developed, which he called modular, which is sort of based on the golden section, and in a sort of Renaissance fashion links all the proportions of the buildings to the human body. He was rather obsessed with it. The overall expression, however, is of course one of, concrete. And this is really what the building is about, and this is what brutalism is about. Le Corbusier referred to this as béton brut, raw concrete, brut, B-R-U-T, and this is the origin of the term brutalism. There were sort of functional reasons for this. Massive building of this size requires the participation of different building contractors. And Le Corbusier argued that it would have been impossible to maintain a consistent standard of finishes amongst so many different contractors. So he made a virtue out of this and just left it all raw and unexposed. But the more important reason probably was this this idea to find an honest expression for structure and an honest expression for materials, which was really unlike what had happened in the 1930s in modernism, where everything was more or less wide-rendered, flat-roofed, etc. And here, this is made out of concrete, and it should look like it was made out of concrete, and it does. It's a sort of arts and crafts idea, going back to John Ruskin, essentially. So this is the Unité d'Habitation, probably the most influential building of the past 100 years. Really, really important building. Also important, but not quite as impressive, is this one here. That's a pair of suburban villas, Maison Jaoul in Neuilly-sur-Seine, outside Paris. Rather cleverly placed, so these are the two buildings, rather cleverly placed on a very narrow site, and really use the natural slope of the site very well to integrate this little car park, which is underneath the common entrance patio, so underneath here. The patio itself is accessed via this ramp, which leads to here. So underneath here is the car park, and this is one, and this is the other building. What can we see here? Again, rough, exposed concrete, especially here, and also here for these sort of awkward asymmetrical arches. But in this case, combined with two rather traditional materials, again, which you never would have found in any of these buildings of the 1930s. So this rough, deliberately imperfect brickwork, and these timber infills, also deliberately imperfect. So this is a sort of attempt to link up with a sort of peasant vernacular. So to bring modernism together with a sort of time-honored regional tradition, far from being an international style, and also far from the 5 points which Corb had promoted in the 1920s and 1930s. Inside, same sort of thing. You have this extremely sort of domestic type of house, which, if you compare it with the Villa Savoie, which looked like a design showroom, this is where people actually live, and it looks like people live here, and it's got these brickwork and sort of traditional elements such as these arches, and this is called a Catalan vault with these tiles, turf roof. So a real sort of change in expression and in approach, as opposed to his earlier buildings. People struggled with this. It sort of, all of a sudden their admired master built something that was completely against, or, seemed to be completely against his own principles. James Stirling, who is probably the best British architect for the past 100 years or so, grew up in Liverpool, studied here as well. He discussed this project, and he was very dismissive of it, but a few years later he built pretty much the same in his housing estate in Ham Common. So Corb did these two buildings, the Unité and the Maison Jaoul, at pretty much the same time. Both had nothing to do with what he did earlier. Both showed a completely new approach to modern architecture. And then, at the same time, he also built this. Now, this really bemused people. It's a chapel in the east of France, not far from Le Corbusier's hometown of La Chaux-de-Fonds, which is in Switzerland, just across the border, about half an hour from where he was born. And he built this sort of sculptural body which is almost impossible to describe. Yeah, it's sort of it's inspired by the contours of the surrounding hills, and it's really a sort of totally unique piece of architecture. Has these concave walls towards the east and north, which are more or less shut, and then on the other side, and they're sort of rather convex, so bending out, with these random seeming windows, which were in fact based again on his modular. You can see the thickness of the wall when you look at these gun slot windows here, and the walls make funny things. I mean, they're really thick at some point, and then they sort of go together, become wafer thin up here. On top of it all sits this heavy cloud of reinforced concrete. A really awkward but highly interesting building, which you have to see it to fully understand it, which is a sign of any good architecture. Inside, same sort of informal arrangement with these really thick walls and these sort of awkward windows in different shapes and sizes. And then you got this gap between these pebble dash walls and the concrete cloud, which gives it almost a sort of neon light effect, indicating the curvature of the wall when you're inside it. But the whole thing almost like a cave, same materials inside and out. So it really, it's almost like a walk-in sculpture. Very complex sort of arrangement, but actually achieved with rather minimal means. There are these 3 hooded towers. We saw one of them just now. So these towers there are 3 of them, and they're integrated with these curved walls, which are sort of juxtaposed, and then you've got these really thick wall over here, and that's basically it. So very interesting. And again, a total step away from what he used to do in the 1920s or 1930s. So he had this creative explosion, putting forward completely different takes on modern architecture, and this one in particular. Young architects in Europe, they looked at this and thought, hang on, our respected master takes liberties with this. Modern architecture doesn't have to be boxy, flat-roofed, white, ribbon windows. No, other expressions are possible. And it really had a liberating effect on his followers, which, who were most European architects. So if he could do it, why can't we? So they started experimenting with different shapes, different forms, and it really sort of almost broke a dam. So the fourth of Corp's seminal post-war buildings, in addition to Chandigarh, which we already saw, which I won't mention again, in Europe, the fourth, is this one here. And this is a Dominican monastery in Lyon called La Tourette. In a way, the most classically brutalist of all his buildings, and really merciless in its sort of in-your-face concrete. I mean, there are no colored, sort of cheery colored effects on the facades here. This is all concrete in a variety of different textures, but still just all concrete. Very, very sort of muscular, terrifying almost. Essentially consisting of 3 spatial layers. So you got the open ground floor again, which is a typical feature of Corp's architecture. In this case, not so much to extend the landscape underneath the building, but rather to sort of mediate the rather steep slope, which we'll see in another picture. And then on top are the actual dormitory cells of the monks, each individually articulated through this balcony, prefabricated. And then in between, we have this sort of semi-public spaces. This one here is the refectory, which is where the monks eat. So ideally, you'd like this to be open, fully glazed. On the other hand, if you imagine this fully glazed, it would really look really awkward. It would make the whole building look flimsy and sort of feeble. and Corb was well aware of that. So what to do about it? What he did was he had the full glazing, but he put concrete mullions in front of it. They're called ondulatoires. This is a sort of method or a means to have openness but closeness as well at the same time. We'll see it a little bit better in another picture. So you can see the ondulatoire here, so these concrete mullions which are set in front of the windows. Usually in a monastery, the key element of a monastery is the cloister. Okay, cloister is a canopied walkway around a common green, which is a common courtyard, which is the public space. And the cloister divides this public, central public courtyard from the more private areas of the monks. That's a cloister. This is what you usually will find in a monastery. Now, there was no way to have a central courtyard here because of the slope of the site. So what Corb did was he reinterpreted the idea of a cloister and of an inner courtyard by having these walkways crossing or going across what he called a virtual courtyard. Okay, so you can't actually access these areas, but you can look at them. And the walkways connect the different spaces within the building, similar in a way in which the cloister had done this. So here's the church, here's the refectory, which I mentioned earlier, with this square-shaped atrium in front of it. There are some color accents here within the courtyard, but none of them outside. Here again, you can see there's a really sort of very strong image of this, concrete block. You can see very well the idea behind the ondulatoire here, which, looking at the building obliquely, really makes it look like a closed wall. But if you're inside, you can look out because it's actually a window. So that was the idea here. Here you can see the slope of the side left open. Very, very interesting building. Incredibly influential. That's really sort of the ultra early brutalist building. Again, a variety of different textures, but all of them concrete, and all of them, as in all the other buildings. So the four buildings which I showed you of Le Corbusier, they share common characteristics in terms of a very workman-like approach to materiality. Okay, concrete. Made of concrete, looks like concrete. That was the sort of common feature amongst them. But they also show a large variety of distinct ways in which this can be done. And as a whole, they provided the basis for a variety of interpretations within this brutalist architecture. And it really people don't give brutalism the credit it deserves in terms of the variety of approaches which it provided. Usually people just say, well, it's concrete brutalism. But there's a large variety of different approaches within brutalism, within this spectrum. We don't really have time to look at them in any detail. What I will do instead is to show you two projects which sort of take up opposite poles within this wide brutalist spectrum. Both are from Switzerland, and both are really good. This one here is a very famous housing estate, Haarlen, by Atelier 5 outside Bern. This is very sort of Corbusian in many ways. It goes back to an unrealized scheme of Le Corbusier of 1949, Roc et Robe. And it has this idea of, as you can see, it's again on a slope, south-facing slope, lovely area. And it tries to imitate, or tries to emulate rather, a Italian hilltop village, complete with this central piazza, which it has here, and then this concrete chimney, which sort of tries to look like a clock tower, which you will find in every Italian town. There's a stepped path leading through here, past this village square, up here, to this public green, which has its own pool, which is rather nice. The square itself has all the sort of village amenities, shops, restaurants, etc. There are two. We don't really have time to discuss the housing arrangements in any detail. I strongly recommend you look them up. You'll find them very easily online. When it comes to housing, or housing layouts, this is about as good as it gets. Very influential again, for instance, on Niamh Brown's Camden housing schemes, which are equally brilliant and which are also worth looking up if you don't know them. Essentially, there are two different house types here. One is the narrow one, and the other one is the extremely narrow one, and that's this one here. So it's all stretched around a very narrow, so in a very narrow way, with accommodation spread over 3 stories to take advantage of this south-facing slope. Really, really good, very compact, high-density scheme. This one here shows this central square with shops and restaurants and sort of children's playgrounds, here in a slightly older picture, and this is a rather recent picture. Typical Corbusian elements, obviously exposed concrete, but not just that, also certain elements such as these perforated loggias here, and these so-called brise-soleil and these small integrated balconies. These two you will also find at the Unité d'Habitation. Exposed concrete, yes, but in a rather more refined way here. This was not built for homeless industrial workers in war-battered France or for sort of frugal Dominican monks. This was built for a rather affluent Swiss middle-class clientele, and the sort of detailing and the quality of finishes really reflects that, apart from being a typical feature of Swiss architecture quite generally. So this is one, and the other one, the other side of the spectrum of brutalist architecture, would be this one. Again, you can see this extreme smooth quality of the exposed concrete. Concrete can be as beautiful as any other material if it's produced properly and maintained properly. That's the floor plan. Much of it sunk into the ground, but even what sticks out still has a rather impressive appearance. The floor plan, obviously inspired by Ronchamp, with this wish to avoid right angles wherever possible, and this sort of informal arrangement. Further, Swiss artist and architect built quite a few of these buildings, mostly churches, but also schools and a bank. And they all look more or less like this. In fact, this is one of his more restrained buildings. Some of the others are considerably wilder than this one. But even this one is, quite something. You can see again this sort of cave-like feel which Ronchamp had as well, and also this sort of informal, sort of indefined illumination through sort of awkwardly placed light sources. One thing that's really interesting here is the way furniture and fittings are combined or fitted in with the concrete structure, which is something, if you know the Barbican in London, it has that as well. You can see it very well here, or here, and even the organ. So it's all sort of designed together, built as one entity, as one unit. It's this idea of architecture, the building as a sort of total work of art, which is something which also goes back to the arts and crafts period, and is something which we saw in our modernism lecture at the Sommerfeld House of Gropius, where the interior is pretty much considered an essential part of the architect's work, just like the building itself. Here you can see the same interior again, different lighting conditions. Notice the precision and care that went into the detailing and the alignment of the timber shuttering along the edges, and also the way these light fittings are flush with the surface. So very careful, very good building. Now, this brings us to the end of the first part, but we are slightly running behind. I wanted to do a little break here, but we're not going to have that one, so I'm just going to change my slides quick. We don't want to run out of time at the end of it. So we're now sort of leaving the immediate post-war period behind and enter the late 50s, 60s, 70s, early 80s. Just to reiterate, Siam planning was based on this division into four functions: dwelling, work, recreation, and transport, and then sort of this extension through a fifth function, this civic core, etc. That's pretty much what they did. In the mid-1950s, a new generation of architects within Siam started to really challenge these ideas, or openly oppose these ideas. This group of young architects were called Team 10, and we will look at some of the buildings that they did. Basically, they argued that, to ordinary people, whether the functions in a city are clearly zoned and divided is really of no relevance. What matters to ordinary people is their connections with other human beings. And these connections, they argued, happens sort of by extending the reach from their own home. So home to the neighborhood, to the district, to the city as a whole. They refer to this as scales of association. And they argued that each scale of association demanded its specific architectural intervention, architectural response. Okay? So this was the sort of key ideas driving the Team 10 group. Team 10, by the way, they were called Team 10 because they were entrusted with organizing the 10th Siam Congress, which turned out to be the last Siam Congress because the different factions just couldn't agree on a common agenda. This is a interesting town planning scheme coming out of this Team 10 context. The competition entry by Allison and Peter Smithson for the Berlin Hauptstadt competition. Now, the idea here was to draft a master plan for a unified Berlin. Neil Jackson mentioned the situation of Berlin in his last lecture. So the idea here was, well, Berlin will be unified and we need a master plan tying it all together. Obviously, unification didn't happen until 1989, so nothing came of this particular scheme. Nothing would have come of it anyway because it didn't win the competition. It came third. But it was by far the most interesting proposal. What we see here, essentially in a sort of strong functionalist Siam context, you'd look at this city and say, this is all rubbish, let's raise it down and build it anew, okay? With the nice zoning and all that. The Smithsons didn't do that. They used the existing street grid as for motorized traffic. And in addition to this existing grid, superimposed on it, they built a pedestrian deck. Okay, so there all of a sudden you have a two-layered city. You have motorized traffic underneath and pedestrians above. And they are linked together via these escalators, and also via these towers, which are dotted. You can see these black dots. These are all high-rises, which provide a connection between the two layers, and not only provide the connection, but also visualize this connection in architectural form. Now, in my introductory lecture, I pointed out that one of the drivers of brutalist architecture and post-war architecture quite generally, the sort of size, the scale it had, was in part driven by this wish to find an architectural expression which could visually compete with these new massive road networks, okay? And this is pretty much an example of this type of architecture. So if you drive here, you can see these towers, and these towers indicate a connection between the two levels. Similar ideas driving these massive, that were supposed to be housing estates, and also these sort of curvy buildings over here, which would have been office buildings. As I said, wasn't realized. This one was. Again, one of the projects emerging from this Team 10 context, probably one of the most, probably the most important one, or certainly one of the earliest ones, and a very famous building, the Orphanage by Aldo van Eyck, very young Dutch architect. It was his first building, and it remained his best building. What do we see here? Essentially, the idea, or architects were conscious of the fact that, or they thought, architecture in future would be based on prefabrication, on industrial building, on system building, okay? And the challenge for architects was to sort of get a hang, or get on top of these systems. The inherent danger of an industrialized building industry is that they develop systems, and you as an architect end up just implementing what others produce for you, which takes your responsibility for the design away from you. And that was a keenly felt danger of post-war architects. They were aware they had to work with systems, but they had to find a way to make these systems work for them, rather than the other way around. And this is what this building shows. You can clearly see this modular grid. It is all based on a 3.6 meter square grid, which is a very small grid for a public building. The idea was to choose this very small grid because this is a building for children, and to sort of give them a more domestic scale, even though it's a vast facility. That was the idea behind it. You can see it very well with these individual pavilions, some of them with skylights. So this, you look at it and you know exactly what the idea behind it is. All of it one story, except this one here, which is where the staff quarters are, overlooking the main entrance and the main courtyard. The courtyards are interesting as well. They sort of they are sort of distinguished between small children and not quite so small children. The small children are here in these their facilities face these fully enclosed courtyards, which gives them shelter and protection, whereas it was thought that slightly older children could have a slightly higher degree of interaction with the surrounding areas, which is why they are open. So it's a very well thought through arrangement, and really interesting when you look at these two plans. Now this is the roof view, which we just saw. Okay, clear with these modular grid. Very little to see of it here. The point of this is, this modular grid was a conceptual grid, okay? It was not a spatial grid, nor was it a structural grid. You can see how the spaces merge into each other. It's sort of They are ambiguous spaces, partly inside, partly outside, flowing into each other. One huge entity, and not supported by individual pillars. So these individual pavilions, they don't indicate a structural grid. The structural grid is completely independent of it. This is the conceptual grid. It's important to understand this distinction. If you look at this plan, by the way, it will remind you, or it certainly reminded me of something. Showman showed us Korea's Gandhi Museum, which apparently was based on sort of East Asian vernacular architecture. I would argue it was also based on this particular building by Van Eyck, which was a very famous building, and which was itself modeled on the idea of a North African Casbah, which Van Eyck knew very well because he spent several months in Africa traveling through Africa. Did Barnabas, who was here first year, last year? Did Barnabas show you the Dogon? Yes? No? Dogon. Residence in Mali. Very specific architecture. These sort of units here, they are modeled on the Dogon's family houses. Van Eyck was pretty much the first architect who had any interest in the workings of the Dogon. This is what it looks like architecturally, or at least what it did look like. These are old pictures. Now it's all painted indiscriminately, which is a real shame. Originally it had this typical combination of exposed brickwork and concrete, which we saw at Maison Jaoul. Again, these pillars here, they indicate the conceptual grid on which the facility is based. They don't actually carry a lot. The interior pillars carry the weight. So this is just to visualize this grid. And you can see these attempts at making, producing a childlike architecture by, the sort of low height of these steps, also the low height of windowsills and glazing bars. Nowadays it all looks a little bit, not very child-friendly. But at the time, it was quite revolutionary to actually even consider the scale of children. This is called a mat building. A mat building sort of reverses the idea of figure and ground. Usually you have ground, and you place your building as an object on this ground. The idea here is that the building covers the entire ground, and spaces are carved out of it. Okay, this is called a mat building, and I went back because this one here is another mat building. Again, Team 10 architects, Candilis Josef Schwarz. This is the Philological Institute of the Free University in Berlin. This is really vast. I don't know about how many 100,000 square meters, but it's immense. The idea here, the conceptual driver of this, are the corridors. Okay. They are the only permanent feature of this building, the corridors. Everything else was subject to change, okay? All the spatial configurations were meant to be replaceable, exchangeable, extendable, however you wished. Only the corridors are permanent. It sort of reflects this sort of 1960s idea of education as sort of pursued without hierarchies. Okay, so lecturers, administrative staff, even students, they could rearrange their spaces according to their requirements at any time. So this was the idea behind this. And this is what it looks like inside. So what you see on this picture, the corridor, is permanent. Everything else could be changed, could be altered. It was, again, developed in collaboration with a very good structural engineer called Jean Pouvet, who developed a system of concrete encased steel columns and steel beams and prefabricated concrete slabs on top of it. And it extends to the facade as well, which is made of Corten steel panels, and which also could be demounted, detached, very easily if you wanted to expand the building. Didn't quite work in the end. I mean, it's still there, and they still use it, and it was renovated, I think, by Norman Foster. But it didn't really work the way it was intended to work. Partly, I would say, because this idea of creating architecture which users can change is something that appeals to us architects. It's a thought that, sort of really an attractive thought as a designer, to create this system which people can then use however they like. But in reality, ordinary people find it much easier to adapt their work routines to a given space rather than adapting the space to their work routines. That's one thing. It was also technically not without flaws. I mean, the whole thing leaked. And because it was, all the partition walls and everything was made of lightweight panelings, sound insulation was pretty poor, which is not a good thing in a university building. But it was a really ambitious idea. Probably the most ambitious scheme which came out of this Team 10 context. An experimental building which, as is the nature of experiments, part of it failed. But worth trying. It had this idea within it, and that's the crucial idea of the Free University, that you have permanent infrastructure and impermanent additions. Okay, so you distinguish between things that have a longer life and things that have a shorter life. And that is a key idea, and is the idea of a megastructure. That's what a megastructure is. It goes back, again, to an unrealized project by Le Corbusier, which you can see here. So you had this, what he planned for Algiers, the capital of Algeria, was this motorway, elevated motorway, along the coastline, cutting into the old town, cutting through the old town, and coming out at the other end. So this was the primary structure, okay? And inserted in this were random infills of housing. So the important thing here is the road. And the secondary thing is architecture. And this was a really sort of, in the 1960s, this became a key idea in urban planning, where you knew you had these motorways, power lines, and all these things that modern cities needed. And these were the major elements, okay? And everything else had to adapt to it and was of lesser importance. That's the idea of a megastructure. And the ones who really pushed this to the limits were Kenzo Tange and his Metabolist group in Japan. Kenzo Tange was not himself a member of the Metabolist group, but he was a father figure. By the way, I mentioned the Tokyo plan in my introductory lecture, and going back through my slides, I noticed that I actually used the wrong picture illustrating it. The picture which I did use in my introductory lecture was another megastructural project by a man called Arato Isozaki, who was a student of Kenzo Tange's. Clusters in the air, megastructural housing scheme. I've meanwhile changed the original slide, so if the slide doesn't look like the vital lecture, that's why. So what we're looking at here. This is, the idea behind this is to extend Tokyo across the Bay of Tokyo, providing accommodation for another 10 million people. So, rather ambitious. The way Kenzo Tange wanted to do this was by having this, oh, that's on its way out, by having, let me just change this. By having this main structure, which you can see here, so this is the primary sort of spine, a string of elevated motorway loops extended into the bay. The first of these loops would have enclosed the existing central business district of Tokyo, and then it's just extended into the bay. This empty one here would have been the new harbor, and here is where offices and all the sort of work takes place. And branching off from this main spine is a secondary spine, linear spine, leading to floating concrete platforms which would have supported all the housing units. Okay? So, you know, quite ambitious. This is what it looks like in detail. So here are these elevated motorway loops, and in between you have all the office buildings, which are multi-story office buildings, basically seen as bridge trusses and carried by massive service towers. And then branching off are these secondary spines leading to these floating concrete platforms. So that's not the actual housing. That's the platform on which the housing would be built, accessed from underneath via this little access road, and then you go into your building. So, you know, just to give you an idea of the scale of the whole thing, each of these, the length of these suspension bridges is more or less the width of the Mersey between Albert Dock and Birkenhead, each one of them. So, you know, absolutely gobsmacking. Now, the interesting thing about this is you don't really know how much of it was meant as a realistic proposition and how much was pure fancy. And that really is sort of encapsulates the 1960s with its enormous energy richness and this total faith in progress. This particular scheme, it could only have been devised in this particular decade. Very influential on European architects, the metabolists. This is perhaps the most ambitious sort of megastructural scheme for a European city by Barkema, who was a founder member of Team 10. Essentially, what we see here, this is Amsterdam over here, and this was meant as a new district for Amsterdam, housing 350,000 people, in the form of a string of artificial islands, which is something the Dutch had been doing for centuries, reclaiming land from the sea and from the swamps via artificial islands, so-called polders. And the whole thing is accessed via this linear spine here, which is the main motorway, and this elevated monorail. And it leads into a new business district called City Pampas, and then turns to the left into a sort of a little bit more business district. The interesting thing here is these buildings here, which again shows you the attempt to find a visual equivalent to this enormous scale of motorways and traffic, and to sort of have a visual pointer. So if you drive on this motorway here, at the end of it, you see this wall-like building turning to your side, which indicates how the whole thing is developed, and then you see the other buildings here. So this is the architectural reason for it. There's a functional reason as well, insofar as this massive, they are office buildings. They separate the noisy new part here from the actual neighborhoods where people live. And they were, you know, arguably quite nice, sort of facing the sea, and each was to be designed by a different group of architects to create variety within this overall scheme. Again, going back to what I mentioned in terms of the schools in Zurich, this idea of a neighborhood unit, which is a sort of running theme. So each of these little neighborhoods would have had its own school, its own church, its own shops, and obviously housing. It wasn't realized. Neither was the Tokyo plan. There are some realized examples of this type of megastructural architecture in Europe. We have a particularly interesting one not far from here, Park Hill in Sheffield. If you don't know it, you should go and see it. It's really marvelous, extremely interesting scheme, which comes out of the same sort of context. Ivor Lynn, who designed it, was a friend of the Smithsons. This one here is Toulouse-le-Mirail by Candilis-Joseph Schwartz again. Again, you can see this idea of having circulation as the generator of the entire scheme. So these grey marked areas, that's basically circulation in the form of elevated walkways and these sort of communal platforms, such as this one here, which sort of, little local centres for the housing estate. And then attached to the circulation spine, these monumental housing blocks, absolutely vast. Candilis-Joseph Schwartz, by the way, built a similar project to this one outside Paris, Bobigny. And when I was your age, naively, stupidly, thought I'd go and have a look on my own. And I ended up being chased by a large group of youngsters who obviously didn't appreciate some entitled student idiot photographing their neighborhood and housing conditions. I escaped unharmed, but I did have to sacrifice my camera, and I've never gone back there since. So you see, architectural history, not entirely risk-free, if you're a bit, not very clever. In Japan, too, some of these metabolist ideas were realized, or at least tried to realize. This one here is Yamanashi Press in Kofu by Tange, and Nagakin Capsule Tower in Tokyo by Kurokawa, both based on the same idea of having these vertical service towers, circulation and service towers, as the permanent fixture of the scheme, here and here, and these ones here, with the rest of it sort of clipped on and detached, however you like it, or whenever, or when they've run its course. These are individual housing capsules, prefabricated, sort of bolted on to the service tower, and they could be detached once they'd run their course, which, of course, in the end never happened. And this really sort of shows the downside of these megastructural ideas, that it just, as far as I know, these are the original configurations of the building. So this sort of replacement of parts once they reach the end of their life cycle never really happened. And in this particular case here, it's actually quite ironic, because this sits in the Ginza district of Tokyo, which is a very vital, fast-changing neighborhood. And pretty much in the 45 years since this was built, pretty much the entire neighborhood has changed beyond recognition. And the only thing that still stands there unchanged was the one building which was actually built for change. So rather ironic. And the megastructure, this idea of the megastructure, in a way, is sort of the climax of this idea of, modernist idea of, this faith in progress, in technology, in, going forward, new, better than old, etc. And it's in the mid-1960s, the tide began to turn. It began to turn on an urbanistic level, inspired to quite some extent by these two books here, Kevin Lynch's The Image of the City, in which he puts forward an idea of mapping cities based on its key urban features, so paths, edges, nodes, etc. And perhaps even more important, Aldo Rossi's L'architettura della città, where he promotes ideas of monumentality, of memory, of archetypes, all things that really didn't feature in the modernist discussion at all, and which sort of linked back to pre-modern ideas of urbanism. Architecturally, too, things began to change. 20 years modernist monoculture after the war, it became rather tedious, and a growing number of architects started to develop their individual takes on modernism or away from modernism. A sort of pluralism of style developed, which is an ongoing process, basically. This is still what's happening today. And in the 60s, 70s, 80s, mostly 70s and 80s, these different tendencies were sort of grouped under the umbrella term of postmodernism. Okay, different tendencies, all sort of challenging the primacy of modern architecture. In the remainder of our lecture today, we will look at three of these tendencies. There are more than these three, but there's only so much time we have. The first one was, in fact, instigated by Aldo Rossi, who spoke with us. So, this is a housing block in Gallarate, Milan. You can see the sort of classically Italian features, a sort of colonnade running along the length of the entire building.